Alrighty, hello folks, and good morning. So, I've seen a lot of comments coming up here, there, and everywhere, kind of disagreeing with each other as far as how difficult Reborn is, and I think it can all be kind of boiled down to one thing. I'm not sure how many folks realize how many different phases there are to this game, so I wanted to kind of see if maybe shedding some light on that might hopefully explain a few things to some folks. Because in a lot of cases, I feel like people are kind of just getting to the end of the main story and thinking, well, I guess I go back and do other routes, and that's the game. That, where is my New Game Plus? I was told New Game Plus was difficult, but I went on a new route and I kicked everyone's ass. What gives? So, here's the deal. There's a lot of different phases, like I said, and if you've heard of folks talking about the post game, how there's a really extensive post game, going back through those other routes, that's the sprinkles on the ice cream. That's not the whole cone. There's way more to it. Okay, so I'm going to start off from the very beginning, just kind of explain what the difficulties are in each kind of section of the game as far as I see it, and then kind of talk about how everything evolves in a sort of grander sense, so to speak, and the kind of feelings that you're expected to kind of feel going into some of these areas. Because that's also another thing. A lot of times I see folks wondering why, for example, the later parts of Palace of the Dead are, easier than, for example, about 3/4 of the way through, and it's really more of just like a mood thing. There's a very particular kind of mood going through those places. It wasn't there in previous versions. Like, it was basically a randomized dungeon back in SNES, and basically that sounds way cooler than it was, by the way. It literally was just, you send in 10 people, they send in 4 units with way higher stats, a couple of your dudes get one shot, you resurrect them, you move on to the next map, you collect your loot, you move on to the next map, and then it didn't bother spawning different maps most of the time, so like 90% of the time you were in the same room as the shopkeeper's room. So, yeah, I don't know if that was just a weird bug or a very oddly specific design decision, because it had the bigger maps back in SNES, you just pretty much never saw them, any darn ways. And then in PSP, it was grueling, is what we're going to go with. I mean, same thing as I was talking about last time with the debuffs on ghosts and things like that. It was definitely not out of the ordinary to just get stun locked the moment you ran into a gremlin. Anyway, okay, we'll get to that when we get to it. Let's go ahead and talk about the different phases of the game and what you're feeling in those different sections. So, first and foremost, Chapter 1 is basically one long tutorial from start to finish. This whole thing is just a tutorial on all kinds of different things. Obviously, you start off with just your basic starter units over here, just kind of a tutorial that, hey, there's going to be some difference depending on your decisions, but you aren't really going to know what those differences are. And even going back through it later, there still won't be much transparency in terms of what was actually making a difference. Like, for example, those that didn't know, if depending on the answers to your questions here at the very start of the game, it'll actually determine the genders of the units that you get. So if you end up being a dick to Lancelot the entire time, he'll send you out with all girls. I'm not sure if he's basically saying, hey, get some frustrations out, but either way, that's what they decided to go with. But anyways, it's like, basically, if you answer all positive the whole time, you get all dudes. If you answer all negative the whole time, you get all ladies, and then everything in between is kind of an up or down of one or the other. Anyways, from there, we move on to stuff like Chrysero, where they're going to tell you, that there's going to be situations where you can save people or not save them, but whether you choose, or whether you say you'll save them or not save them, and what you actually do afterwards, all of these things are kind of separate decisions, as it were, where just because you said that you saved them, or said that you were going to save them and failed, doesn't necessarily mean that you were always going to be forced to save them. Whereas if you said that you weren't going to save them and saved them anyway, you're not getting penalized necessarily for that either. But either way, the actual results of this decision are kind of more in the background. Funnily enough, this is actually one that they changed back to the SNES version at this point, where Sistina, back in the original SNES version, if you said that you were going to save her and failed, it just carried on, just like it does in Reborn, whereas in PSP, if you said that you'd save her and didn't, it assumed that you meant to, and it just gave you a game over at that point. Alright, anyway, from here you got some Chaos Frame answers for later, depending on how you talk with Tardy there about your sister. And then we go on to Chapter 2. So the end of Chapter 1 is basically like the game finally telling you, like, okay, look, this is your first big boy decision, are we doing a genocide? Like, how many Geneva Conventions are we treating as Geneva suggestions around this time? So you kind of go for whichever route you decide to go for, and then we go from there. So, one way or another, town's burning to the ground, whatever you happen to do. So, at that point, let's just say we decided to go down Chaos over here. If you didn't know, they're actually, like, this is meant to be more of a quiet time. Like, you had this big event that just happened, and all of this, like, regardless of which route you go for, you're basically now suddenly finding yourself kind of on the back foot here. You're no longer the one leading charges. You're kind of meant to be exploring, kind of lost in the wilderness, so to speak. Like, obviously, for most of Chapter 2 Chaos, you're basically wanted. Which, by the way, an interesting note, if you didn't know, if Ravnus gets killed off on your particular playthrough, she actually does have her death scene over here. It wasn't incorporated into the main story itself, but it is in the Warren Report if you want to go check it out. And then if you decide to save her, there's multiple scenes in which you're going and basically just trying to save her through different routes. Anyway, that's kind of a whole long story all of its own, but there's a lot of little side stories that are going to start popping off around this point. So Chapter 2 is basically your introduction to the factions of the world, where you're going around, or the factions of the island more so, where you're going around and kind of interacting with the different groups, like your Liberation Front over here, or well, later on down the line, you start running into Vice's people. Actually, his people are going to be more of a Chapter 3 thing. But either way, it's starting to set the tone for kind of where everybody's at in terms of their momentum. Chapter 3 is where stuff really starts to split, because at the end of Chapter 2, you're kind of getting to that feeling of like, okay, everything's kind of escalating. You're expected to be on one side or the other at this point, so are you picking a side or are you staying neutral? So if you decide to not pick a side, funnily enough, kind of staying on your own neutral side, so to speak, is the Chaos route, where you end up... actually, this is Law that I'm showing right now. Is going to be the Chaos route over here, wherein essentially you're just kind of going off on your own. You and your people are just more or less tearing through the countryside, doing your own thing. Meanwhile, over here on neutral, more or less you're taking Vice's place, because you decide to rejoin. He's not having it. He wants you dead, and so basically you start doing the stuff that he would have done in a previous route. Meanwhile, over here on Law, you're continuing to follow your orders at this point, and you start seeing that, you know, Vice is doing his kind of background faction thing around this point. But all of this is meant to start giving you a feeling that you're kind of coming up in the world. As far as game challenge goes, you're starting to see a lot more mechanics showing up at this point. Like, I personally like the archer example, whereas like in Chapter 1, you have your archers and they're just going to fire and they're going to be just fine. They're going to hit stuff with no issues. Around Chapter 2 is around the point when you would start noticing, like, okay, I want to fire on elemental weaknesses. You know, this is a unit that's going to get most of its power when it's exploiting a defense breach of some sort. So if I'm firing on an elemental weakness, that's going to be something. And then around Chapter 3 is when you start seeing a bit more of that, where it's like, okay, now I'm definitely wanting to target those weaknesses a bit more. Maybe I'm going to be relying on crits, maybe picking my shots a little bit more with those archers. Maybe swapping out for crossbows every now and then rather than longbows. And then, you get the Terror Knight around this point, and you start realizing, like, oh, shoot, if I start throwing around some debuffs, if I throw around some breaches, some fears, all of that kind of thing, suddenly I can be one-shotting units with just a couple of debuffs. So this is around the point when the actual kind of mechanics and world start expanding a lot more. But we're still basically in the second tutorial, as I like to call it. And then we get to Chapter 4, which is basically the end of the main tutorial, and the end of the main story route, anyway. So whatever choices you made at this point, it'll all kind of come together in one very big, wide chapter. Like, 4 is by far the longest chapter in the game in terms of how wide everything can go. This thing can go anywhere from, like, 2.5 hours long to, hell, I think technically more like 3 or 4 hours long, to potentially hundreds of hours long, depending entirely on the routes that you want to take. Like, whether or not you're going off to do all the side stuff, going off and doing all of the elemental temples, whether you're going off to do all of the Buccaneer side quest, whether you're going off to go save Oshone, whether you're going to do some Palace of the Dead, whether you're doing those elemental temples for the Shaman side quest, whether you're doing Deneb and her labor union. The Pumpkin Labor Union. If Saria had survived up to this point, whether you essentially kill her or save her and the pirate captain that they're with. There's a whole lot of different ways that this one can go, but this is meant to be tying together the main story of, like, kind of how the world ends up shaping up over the course of this story. But the thing is, the game doesn't end here. Like, there's a lot that's happened up to this point. There's a lot that's shaped the world and everything else. But there's 4 more chapters after this. After you get through Hanging Gardens and everything. Now, we're not going to see very much of it on this particular map right here, but there's essentially 4 Coda Chapters. They don't show up with too many icons because it doesn't seem particularly fancy. But basically, your first one is going to be a little bit of a side quest, going and looking for Canopus' sister. Second one is getting Warren out of hell. Third one is recruiting, essentially going back in time, realizing that you can go way back in time to different routes entirely, to go recruit and change the outcome of the end of Chapter 2, and then finally you go back and you fight your way through the intro of the game for the final chapter. Now, while all of this sounds like just, basic bare bones extra content, this is really where a lot of the kind of crazier mechanics come into play. So if you were wondering, for example, if you were looking through the videos and you were wondering, like, what the hell was the point of some of these weirdly specific min-maxes? Like, I got, my casters and they're doing damage just fine. Why would I care over how much I might be able to, breach and fear a unit to get them killed off with a crossbow or something? Like, why would a build like this even be necessary? This is complete overkill. Well, the post-game is where this stuff matters. And what's interesting is that all of the kind of side areas all bring with them a very different feeling. So I'm pretty sure everyone knows about Palace of the Dead. That's going to be the biggest and longest one. But all of them have a very particular vibe to them when you're going through them this time around. And yeah, there's quite a few maps, but you're meant to feel something. You're meant to learn something. It's like all of these areas, every time you go through them, you'll usually make some little discoveries about how you built your party or whatever else. Some kind of little new things will start coming to light. There will be a lot of these like little mental discoveries in these different locations. Let me just go ahead and show some of these areas real quick. But they all will mean something different. And the reason that I'm kind of going into this here is because a lot of this was very different back in PSP. Because in PSP, most of the side areas were just kind of an extra area that you go into. You go in there to collect your loot. You go in there to collect your crafting books. And then you go back and you throw all your loot Monster Hunter style at the shop. And then hope you get some good stuff out of it. And then you go back and grind some more. Whereas this time around, all of these different zones have been given a very particular vibe to them, So, like, for example, Wildwood used to just be the place that you go in to grind money. And this time around, I've heard many folks say that they were going in, they weren't realizing what the point of it was. If you weren't getting your crafting books, like, is it just for money? Is it just for that? What's the point? And the point is that there is a wide variety of units and a wide variety of different maps, as well as a wide variety of units that will be dropping charms. So if you are looking for an early game place to farm charms and things, in a strictly mechanical sense, it will work for that. But also, it's going to be a place where you get a lot of unit types much earlier than you would if you were just waiting to get them otherwise. So if you wanted, your griffins, your dragons, your cyclops, your octopi, all of that kind of thing, they're just available here right away. If you wanted zombie hawkmen or something, you can just go and recruit them in here. If you wanted to go get your swordmasters, your ninjas, your terranites, your dragoons, all of that one chapter early, you clear through Wildwood and you start finding those people in there. Essentially, this is going to be an area that you're kind of going in to sort of test how your party works against a lot of different unit types, test how they do when, just outnumbered in some scenarios. And it's interesting because, again, they redid this area. So that early on, you actually can deploy more than you used to be able to, and then later on you're sticking to the same deploy limits, but you can definitely field a larger amount of units. Like, for example, one of them is this kind of U-shaped, I always call it Black Forest because it reminds me of Age of Empires, where there's just going to be one guy trying to carve through the trees over there, and meanwhile everybody else is trying to fight through the choke point. But basically that's around the point when you start kind of getting that feeling over the power of, like, kind of beyond the horizon attacks there suddenly coming in as they're coming in with their extended range warlocks and stuff, and hitting you from beyond the trees, and it's kind of giving you this chance to test out some of the stuff you'll run into later game in a still fairly safe environment. Like, it's still primarily a place that you go through, you get resources, you get items, but you're testing, your team against these different units. You're maybe running into unit types that you won't have a safe opportunity to go pick up somewhere else. This is, functionally speaking, the Safari Zone. Let's just go with it. Go with that. But that being said, let's talk about some of the other side areas. Pirate's Graveyard. So back in PSP, this again was just another grind zone. You went in there to go get your leg guard stuff and some of your elemental vests early. Now, the elemental vests are something that you get exclusively, well, pretty much exclusively in Palace of the Dead at this point. So the purpose of Pirate's Graveyard to many seemed a bit lost at first. But this is basically advanced Farampa Wildwood, where you're going in and it's kind of... the vibe of this place makes me think of if you've ever played original Resident Evil and then compared it with Resident Evil Remake. You know how they added that back hallway at the very start, where it's like, you know this area. This feels like a weird change to throw in here. But then every time you go through it, you appreciate it a little bit more. Like, I can't put into words why I like this, but it feels good that it changed this way. So Pirate's Graveyard used to be a place that you go in and it would whoop your ass in PSP as if you came in with these sort of quote-unquote meta approaches. So, for example, if somebody was coming in, they were just rocking all anatomy archers and stuff like that, there was a pretty real chance that they would start running into heavy beast units that those archers could not penetrate the armor of because their anatomy bonus no longer applied. Now, this was mostly just a weird scaling issue in PSP, but it was a place where, for example, there were units that, the way that people consider summoners in Reborn, that's what people consider archers in PSP. That's the closest simile here. But anyway, there were a bunch of unit types that would suddenly just hard counter those particular units, so it tended to be a place that didn't get explored much. Now, this time around, you still have those units there, and a lot of them are actually placed in slightly different locations, or the context around them has changed a little bit, so that it's basically the place you go to safely acquire a lot of your advanced classes. And a lot of the maps feel kind of like empty or desolate, or just like you're clearing through some hallways in Dark Souls or something. Like, this is just, daily job kind of territory clearing through these guys, but then you're kind of going and having this kind of shopping experience of like, well, there's a hoplite over there. I could use some hoplites. Oh, there's a Juggernaut over there. Oh, Matriarch. Okay, I could use some of those. I'll take some of those, a couple of Hawkman archers over there with some Thunderbows. Okay, I like relics. I'm gonna take some relics. Like, you pick and choose your relics. They don't really drop that often here, but it's a place that you go and you essentially hire relics into your group. Now, granted, if you're getting into the post-game, this is something that you could also do over here in Farampa as well around this point, but it's kind of, it first starts being natural for Pirate's Graveyard here, and that's usually around the point when you start realizing like, okay, maybe levels have gone up, maybe it's useful to go back to the Wildwood, recruit some of those random units, get some maxed out Thunderbows. This actually could be a really useful tool for me, and you might realize that I'm really pushing the archers to some degree here, and simply put, because they have a tendency to get underloved. So I like to mention that they're out there. So anyways, as far as Pirate's Graveyard goes, you may have heard that it was pointless aside from the Azliston side quest, but no, it's definitely got other stuff going on there. There's a lot of interesting recruits, like if you go back in Coda 1, for example, there's going to be an Ice Lich in there, there's going to be just weird, unusual units all over the dang place in there. But primarily, if you're looking to acquire a whole lot of lizards for your team, that's going to be the easiest ways to get them. Now, next, we go and talk about the elemental fortresses. So these are going to be 6 maps located all around the map. And the way that this goes is if you're acquiring the shamans, you will have already explored these. But basically what it boils down to is that they're going to be essentially fort maps you clear out, then you go back and then you clear them out a second time, this time with a 5-floor dungeon. And it's going to give you a bunch of interesting type theming ideas. Now, these are not particularly difficult fights. Primarily, they're just busy work to get through it, but they do such a good job of explaining why certain things might be threatening. Like, I can't even tell you, like, the sudden realization upon going through Bode for the first time. At least I think it was Bode. Just going through it for the very first time, and having that feeling where I had specifically gone out of my way to pick up a Cyclops on my very first file, and it was like, great, this is, a pretty cool class. I always thought it really sucked in PSP, and then I was trying to make it work, and I couldn't quite figure out, why does this thing feel weak? Did something go wrong balancing-wise? And it was one of those ones that I felt bad for, because I went and I had even written to the customer support team a few times, I'm not sure something's right with this with the Cyclops here. I don't think I've ever run into a threatening Cyclops. Is this thing working right? And granted, I didn't follow my own advice in that situation, because there were so many cases where I've said over the years, like, whenever these guys make a project, assume everything is intentional, and assume you haven't figured out why yet. But anyway, so this particular case, there's one of the spawns here, I want to say it can spawn like up to 3 of them or something, but the very first time, I've just been clearing out, you know, map after map after map, and I go in here, and I run into my first Cyclops with Howl. Bear in mind, this was still first playthrough, I hadn't run into Dorgy yet, but that sudden realization of like, holy crap, Howl will whoop your ass if you're not paying attention to it. Like, this is ridiculously good. Like, I was used to the old PSP version where it was basically like 30% chance to hit and expensive to use, and why would you bother? And then this time around, they're like, okay, here's this like turbo fast unit that's auto stunning everything around them. Like, it's just melting their turns, like glare making the difference between reaching a unit or not. Like, man, oh man, oh man, it is quite the difference, I gotta say. So, like, there's a lot of these cases where you're gonna run into these units where, like, most of these guys will be fairly standard kind of jobber setups, and then you'll run into 1 or 2 that are set up to showcase something very specific, and, like, it just feels good when you see those moments, you know? So either way, I love to see that. You know, you have those many cases where you'll have them doing a pretty good job of showcasing how good pincers can be and stuff like that. I mean, pincer in many cases just makes the AI feel like they do such a good job of making use of the skill. Definitely feels like they're working in tandem more often. But it's another one of those like little subtle things of the AI loves to use pincer so often, and a lot of time on the player side we have a tendency to use it less often, or rather just kind of forget it in the midst of trying to do all these other complicated things, or assuming that stuff falls off. Nothing falls off if you stick to it. Like, there's practically nothing in this game that won't be utterly amazing if you just give it some love and pay attention to it a little bit. I always love that design philosophy of just like, you can make anything overpowered. It's the same thing I love about stuff like Armored Core, Dark Souls, all that kind of thing. That same mentality of just you can make anything work if you like it. Anyway, so yeah, there's a lot of these little like showcase builds right here. Like going through the water temple, you'll run into so many cases where, you know, you'll go into there and they're just bombarding you with a bunch of breach bubbles, and you're like, oh shoot, I didn't realize how good this debuff can be. So either way, there's that. Now, this is all stuff that you can get into some of this stuff in Chapter 4, some of it in Chapter 1, or Chapter 1 of Coda. Honestly, it depends, like, when and where you do them. I feel like it's definitely a lot more freeform than it used to be. If you've ever heard that advice of you have to have done your main story some particular way, you really don't. Realistically, as long as Kashua has survived your story, that's the only thing that can realistically make you lose out on... Like, that is to say, that's the only kind of inconvenient thing that'll make you lose out on any content. The only... Like, most of the time, if somebody's doing what's typically referred to as their kind of golden file, or their golden timeline, or what have you, typically the way that you would do that... due to Palace of the Dead having shortcuts that'll work in all situations now, or almost all situations, you can far more safely just kind of do whatever you want for your main storyline. As long as Kashua survived, you can make your way through Codas 1 through 4, just kind of experience that whole situation. If you want to specifically do some of the really weird, like, hidden endgame stuff, like, for example, getting a hold of the Fire Seal and the Ogre Blade and all of that kind of stuff, like the super OP, like, utterly broken, turn a unit into a god type crap, that's the kind of situation that you'd have to clear Palace of the Dead in Coda 4, but you can just go back in time once you complete the game. You can go back in time, you can just go through it a lot easier, use your manuals from whenever you completed it, and then you just quickly breeze through it. It's like, somebody told me that I was wrong last time, it's actually like 6 maps to actually complete the entire thing if using the manuals. So, either way, 6 or 8 or something like that, but it's still some really tiny number. The longest that this one takes, if you're taking the shortest route, is going to be 60 maps. But if you are going for a full clear, it'll be a bit longer. But next, let's go ahead and talk about Palace of the Dead, because, man, I love what they've done with Palace of the Dead this time. Regardless of, just in general, regardless of which part you're in. Because there's 2 different kind of stories going through the place. You have the Nibith story, and you have the Roderick story. So, if you're going through the Nibith story, that's going to be in Chapter 4. If you've basically, if you've pissed off Nibith up to that point, there's some ways that you can make him not show up, as I recall, but realistically, that feels like one of those things you have to be trying to do. Anyway. So, basically the deal is that you're going into Palace of the Dead just chasing Nibith all the way down in order to, prevent him from achieving whatever the hell he's there to achieve. Realistically, you're there to achieve the same thing, which is to acquire all of your sweet artifacts and, extra ungodly powers and what have you. But the vibes of this place have changed so much since PSP. Like, back in PSP, you have to realize, in order to get specific drops, it literally was a case of needing to know when specific units were in specific places to know that they would spawn, and then reset them over and over to get their bag for their one particular drop. Okay, Palace of the Dead, for those that don't know, is a 115-floor dungeon where pretty much every map can be just like brimming to the top with all kinds of fancy loot for you to get. But back in PSP, usually there was like 1 or 2 good drops, if that, per map. And usually there were only a couple of, usually only a couple places to actually get them in the course of the entire place. So, like, if you wanted to get your wing boots and stuff like that, there was specifically a Valkyrie on floor 25 or something that you needed to go take out. And the thing is, this typically led to a situation where when you're looking at the kinds of items that you were getting, and a lot of times back in older versions, especially in PSP, it was the most stingy in PSP. If you were going into a blind, there's no reason for you not to be able to clear it just by struggling your way through, but it was basically grueling. It wasn't necessarily difficult. There was a lot of cheap crap in there, like I mentioned earlier. If you ran into a couple of gremlins, you basically could see a unit permanently stun-locked. If you didn't bring counters to something like Bewitch, if you're wondering why Bewitch isn't in this version, because it just pissed people off, because we're talking about a debuff that caused loyalty to drop with every turn that it was there. You couldn't get rid of it through normal charm removal means, and in many cases you would just have fairies flying in or gremlins flying in, bewitching a unit, and you've just lost all control over them. Now, you try to use an anti-charm thing on them, it won't do anything. Did you forget to make a gigantic stack of your, potentially failable, Zolia drop plus ones? Oh, I'm sorry. Your unit's now mind-controlled. I hope you like seeing that crafting animation 50 times. Hopefully that'll be enough. Anyway, that particular thing was a bit of a nuisance. In general, it was just, like, you were probably in there for a couple of weeks. It was going to take you a while. It was by no means a quick experience, and you'd be lucky if you got 10 drops that were actually something that you wanted over the course of the entirety of the Palace of the Dead, if you were just clearing through it, if you were just running through, okay? You really didn't get stuff that often. I've had cases where I literally only got, I think one of them was just, Hoarfrost boots, and some Earth boots, and I want to say I got, a Pinion Blade or something. There was some random weapon I couldn't even use on that particular save file because the team set up, and because you didn't really have a whole lot of, flexibility of switching people into other weapon types without a whole bunch of extra effort in that version. Anyway, point being, basically wound up with practically nothing going through in the PSP version. But this time, the way that they changed it is frickin' brilliant. So, the first 25 floors, there's honestly not much going on. It feels very similar to the old PSP version. It's there to lull you into this idea that it's similar. Pretty much the best stuff that you're going to be getting around this point are going to be some of your movement rings, you get some cloud rings. And cloud rings are one of those things that, or cloud rings, water rings, lava rings, they're ones that are very specific in terms of their situational usefulness, but they're typically not something that would be terribly fancy. Previously, you used to get them way the hell down there in Palace of the Dead. Now you get them right at the beginning. So, either way, there's a decent chance you're going to wind up with a few of those, and they're firmly in that category of this is a nice little appetizer. Okay, I might find a use for this. And then also, every archer down there for those first 25 floors has a chance to drop a crescent. There's a lot of crescents that can drop. Now, this is a very particularly good detail. See, back in PSP, the crescent was considered a missable item by many, because the crescent and the cupid Cupid bow were pretty friggin' rare, and you specifically had to be in a particular level range for it to even drop. The important part about it this time around is that it's actually a crafting component. The reason that you get so many of them at this point is not only to clue you into the fact that Cupid bows are actually really freaking good, which now you have to make the Cupid bow in order to make your other elemental bows, but you also don't need the fancy elemental bows to make the basic elemental bows this time around. This was another one of those little brilliant changes, and it does tie into Palace of the Dead design here, because previously you'd go through Palace of the Dead and you'd either want to recruit your advanced archers or, hope that they drop their bows in order to, well, actually in a lot of cases you couldn't recruit them because a lot of times they came on the blue variants, so you just kind of hope that they dropped a fancy bow. But basically you would be looking and farming and fishing for these particular bows in order to then have like a 40% chance of upgrading them into some super overpowered version for your already friggin' overpowered archers, right? Anyway, so they had a tendency to be a pretty hot ticket item at that time. But this time around, you're going and you're getting a pile of these crescents, and it's not only a way of conveying, like, hey, look, guys, we know about the crescents last time, but it's also letting you have an opportunity to not have the other bows just yet, but to try out this Cupid bow for a little bit to see how good that is. Because this is also around a point in the game where typically many players will have not figured out that if they stack a bunch of defense breaches, they're going to start seeing some pretty great numbers. But this creates a fun moment where previously archers had their heyday. Now all of a sudden they have a bit of a quiet moment around this point. They haven't gotten any more advanced upgrades. They're still probably running their Siege +1s or something like that. And suddenly they're getting their crescents, and they're not really a massive upgrade. And then you get the Cupid bow. It's like, well, this is pretty cool. All right, I have a guaranteed mind control gun. This will work, I guess. And so you start testing that out a little bit. You start seeing how good it can be to charm backfield units, to get them to kill off other units, to make sure that they drop their loot bags in safer places and not fighting you nearby ledges. But on top of all of this, you now have this moment where you already have these crafting components on hand, so that when you get the crafting books that start around the 30s of POTD, those are those moments when you start getting flooded with crafting books. Like, you might have been wondering up to this point, like, I only got 2 crafting books in each of the elemental temples. I didn't get anything back in the Wildwood. I didn't get anything over there in Pirate's Graveyard. So what gives? And then that's that moment where they're suddenly like, hey, guess what? Library of Alexandria down here. You suddenly got like friggin' 20 crafting books coming your way. You just get all of them, one after another after another. They just open the floodgates of just like 3 chance drops of the same book in every fight. Like, you're basically guaranteed to get about half the crafting books with every playthrough of Palace of the Dead. It's almost comical how absolutely dense it is with all of those books in one area, and it feels great. So it just feels wonderful to be like, yeah, I guess we'll just throw away all those copies of the Cudgel Enchiridion because we already have several. Anyway, like for the long timers, like this little moment in POTD was such a frickin' treat. Anyway, so that moment feels fantastic, and so suddenly you're getting kind of lured in, and then you get more and more and more drops building up to around the 50s. But then 50 to 75 gets more and more and more intense, with a lot of the fights being a lot more overwhelming than you'd expect from anything up to that point. You suddenly start finding those moments where they're coming in like 7 or 8 cockatrices, all empowered right from the get-go, because they have their beast tamers set up where their recovery time is gonna go and take about the same time as they are just passing by them. So it's this cool moment of just seeing this wave of birds fly forward, all get buffed, and then continue to fly forward towards you. Like, even though you have the high ground, you won't have it for long, kind of a situation. But yeah, those fights get more and more and more intense, and then finally around like floor 75 is when a lot of the maps just feel outright impossible on your first playthrough. But then finally you get through it. You get through this whole feeling of all these maps. You get this whole idea of like just the weird cheese you've cooked up using whatever team you've got on hand at that point, to just barely squeeze your way through. I was wondering how it's going to go from here on out. And then it plateaus and chills out, and everything from like 76 to 100 is just a coast of like this realization of like, you've become the monster you were scared of going in here for, and now this place should fear you, as suddenly you're getting all of these upgraded pieces of equipment, all of this upgraded armor, all of this other stuff. You're realizing what your team was capable of this whole time, and then you strut out of there looking like freaking like Vince McMahon or whatever else, going into Coda 3. And so Coda 3 is basically a victory lap. It is by far probably the easiest chapter in the frickin' game. It's a quick shot where you've just kicked Neb's ass. Like, you completely stomped through that place. Oh, actually, wait a minute. I'm still talking about Chapter 4. Okay, whatever. Quick side step back. We'll talk to Coda 3 later. Anyway, whatever way. You walk out of there, and it's just like seeing daylight for the first time. You got your Secrets of the Master. You got your shortcut manuals so that you can go back to whatever parts of the Palace of the Dead you'd like. You've probably gone through the shops in there, because your shops were pretty limited in there. You've only got 2 of them. And it probably gave you a very quick appreciation over how good some of your sustainable units are compared to your items. Anyway, it's just a great feel. Like, the way that they paced it all out this time, it's so good. Alrighty, got a little excited there and ran out of space. So, anyway, so like I was saying, I just really love the pacing of Palace of the Dead this time around. It just feels so nice to have that big opening moment upon getting out, and especially like once you get to the final sections after about 75 or so. Part of the reason that it feels like reaching that plateau is because all of the maps suddenly open up in a much wider area, and a lot of them are far flatter at that point. Not to mention, you typically have better tools for dealing with the stuff there, and some of the enemy placements are a bit less cruel and stuff like that. Like 75 in particular is just one where it's absolutely devious how quickly you can get overrun by cockatrices, the kinds of spawns that can come in there. But then you start realizing those moments of like, well, if I recruit those zombies over there, if I charm that one over there, if I poison this one over here, and I stop that one over there, like, you start realizing how good some of these combinations can be. The stuff that's really been with you the entire game hasn't gone anywhere. It hasn't dropped off. Many times there's that assumption that stuff, drops off, becomes less powerful. This is the later game, we need to have the big fancy things. When in reality, going back to basics is just a really good choice. So yeah, the stuff that was powerful back in the early game is still going to be powerful here. But once you realize that that's still there, once you realize those moments like where you have a lot of enemies are going to be dropping black lizard powder there, and you have those moments when you realize, like, oh, they dropped some charm, they dropped some black lizard powder. Wait a minute, I go snort some of this weird, death cocaine, and now I'm able to instantly mind control that guy with my wizard at least 30% of the time. I was like, well, those odds aren't great, but you're saying there's a chance. So either way, it just feels good, So I love the way that it's been paced, but let's get on to other areas. So you go through Hanging Gardens, and Hanging Gardens is another, well, it's just going to be right here, but Hanging Gardens is one of those places where also it's meant to be kind of a mechanics check to see if you've been paying attention. So this time around, for the actual endgame gauntlet, like before, it was fairly freaking easy. Like, realistically, you usually would just go in, shoot everything, and go hit Dorgy twice and go home, as the saying goes. This time around, though, like, he himself is bringing in a lot of the stuff that you may have potentially encountered along your journey, like that, especially due to that Cyclops moment my first time through, when I go and I see Dorgy running around with Howl at the same time. Like, you devious bastards, how could you? It's such a solid moment, Anyway, but anyway, so the entirety of Hanging Gardens is basically just a check for, like, we're going to find out if you've been able to deal with, like, maps with 2 different vertical fights going on, or maybe, moving units off to separate locations, or maybe being overrun, or maybe, being approached from multiple sides, or what have you. And then it just gets easier and easier and easier until you finally get to just kind of the last stand, which is just a complete pushover. You get your last couple boss fights, and then the game ends. But then we get into the Coda stuff. So Coda are basically revisitations of a lot of those side areas in a more endgame sense. Like, if you visited Pirate's Graveyard back in Chapter 4, then Pirate's Graveyard looks like a place where, Azelston's showing you the way through. There's all of these lizards everywhere. You literally find him surrounded by a circle of lizard corpses when you're going through there. And pretty much it's a whole journey of him explaining why anyone bothers going there in the first place, that the whole place is supposed to hold all of these great values and whatever else, but back in PSP, they did. They held all of these fancy treasures, and there was always a question of why did nobody go in here to go get all these fancy treasures. Same thing for Rampa. And it's something I brought up a lot in older videos back then of like, if any of these armies figured out to go into their side dungeons, man, this place would be screwed. But instead, you see the occasional unit running around with something fancy, but there's nothing fancy actually dropping there. And that kind of creates this interesting little mystery over what the hell is the point of this place then. And then you finally get to the very end, and he's like, yeah, no, this place is just sentimental value. It sucks. This place is a complete, like, just very shiny, crystallic, just shithole. But hey, it's or as they put it, a desolate cliffside strewn about with junk. But it's just an interesting little recontextualization of that scene. It gives it so much more weight this time around. But when you're revisiting it a second time for Yuria's side quest, you're basically now chasing her through, and now this place is dark. You're fighting similar maps, but obviously it's Coda, so enemies are going to be harder and everything else. But you can take a shorter route through the place, and then if you decide to go revisit the place that Azelson was showing you the first time, that's where you find that Ice Lich. Which honestly, now that I think about it, I should have named it Lugia. Anyway, so either way, gave me a lot of Pokemon Silver vibes this time through. Anyway, you suddenly are experiencing a lot of different units as she's suddenly summoning in things like angels and whatnot, and it's like, what the hell is going on in this place? But you get a new class out of it. You will have experienced a more intense version of how it was the first time through, but the second time feels more, just like, it feels more filled out. Like, it feels like somebody intentionally laid a bunch of ambushes, because obviously that's the point, but it feels more intense the second time through, and it's the first time I've ever gone through Pirate's Graveyard in any version, whether it's PSP or One Vision or this one, that I've actually been curious to just go explore the side areas without looking at a guide and trying to figure out what the hell was over there. Because I actually wanted to go see some of these other maps this time. Anyway, so that gets us through Coda 1, which unlocks two things. It unlocks Coda 2, which is basically a journey through Palace of the Dead a second time, and it unlocks the San Bronza Ruins. So, San Bronza is the one that I'd actually recommend going through first, because it's funny, whichever route you decide to go through, it'll make the other route far easier. If you take the Palace of the Dead route, you can use your shortcuts from before to just clear through the place real quick, go to floors 1 through 115, but you'll end up missing out on getting the Fire Crest and Ogre Blade and stuff like that early. However, if you went to San Bronza first, or rather, I should probably mention that in floors 1 through 115, you'll end up picking up stuff like the Aegis Shield and Archon Helm and stuff like that, which will make you especially strong going back and approaching San Bronza. Just Aegis Shields, anyone with an Aegis Shield, if you've gotten that with any decent rolls whatsoever, will just friggin' eat any kind of stronger hits coming your way. But then if you decide to go through San Bronza first, man, oh man, this place was just... Okay, PSP had a weird problem with this place, and I should mention that half these locations, literally all of it aside from the Elemental Temples and Pirate's Graveyard, didn't even exist back in SNES or PS1 or any of those. But going through San Bronza back in PSP was a just complete bummer, because it was designed in a similar way at that point to how Rampa Wildwood was, kind of, in theory. Because the way they were supposed to be designed is a tiered thing where you'd come in, you'd kind of get through it part of the way, then you'd kind of run into a brick wall and then turn around. However, Rampa was sectioned off on the different chapter unlocks that unlocked it, so you unlocked different stuff as you went along. Mostly this was to prevent you from unlocking certain things way, way earlier. Like, for example, technically speaking, if you could explore all of Rampa back in PSP, you could create archers that not only one-shot stuff, but if they somehow didn't one-shot stuff, they had a guaranteed chance to prevent them from acting on their next action. Right from as soon as this place unlocked in Chapter 2. Now, that being said, this was mostly just because, they're like, okay, we're excavating new areas, you're going and exploring new things. This is something that Zelda and Pokemon love to do all the time, of just the area that you go back to and explore a little more each time. Just for the hell of it, you want to see what's in there, you want to see these other new maps and locations and whatever. It's kind of just pleasant to go through. Whereas San Bronza, it's designed as just this is basically you running D-Day on Heaven. You are going in there and you are invading the frickin' sky. The lore of this... Okay, that was super weird. For some reason, some random stuff went haywire. Anyway, so, like, the lore of this place is basically those, you know how you went to the elemental temples earlier and they gave you those powerful spells or whatever? So the idea is that at some point somebody got so freaking carried away, incidentally the same guy that's showing up in Palace of the Dead Round 2, the guy got so carried away that he blew a city into the sky so hard that it just kind of stayed there. Now, this is also partially implied to then sort of float up and connect to possibly the floating island from March of the Black Queen, and possibly the floating island from Night of Lotus. It's kind of unclear, but there's kind of references to both in there. Anyway, let's go ahead and load up the save file real quick so we can show that off. So, what I love about this place is how much better they present, like, how much better they presented this whole story. Because the idea is supposed to be that you're only going in here because somebody put out a report of like, yeah, so that floating sky island showed up again. We're not really sure what to think about that, but it is kind of cool, you know? So you show up and there's really nothing going on these first couple maps. You show up and there's just a bunch of random hostile enemies, but there is a chance that you'll end up encountering an item called an Ensanguined Rood if you decide to redo this first map a second time. Now, basically what this means is if this one unit decides to drop this fairly rare item, you've now unlocked a class that you can't quite use yet, but it's interesting that it's there. It's just kind of weird. It's just like, what's the deal with this bloody Jesus fork? This is just kind of funky, but whatever. Either way, once you get in here, you have a big, just friggin' gigantic open map where you're exploring. I mean, hell, you basically have to take 3 rounds to even approach the enemies on the other side. And realistically, they've got a bunch of long-range attacks, they've got a bunch of AoEs, they've got birds coming down on you. It feels like a big open, you know, this is why, it just feels like a big open fight. This is why I say that it feels like this place was modeled after somebody doing a medieval take of if somebody does D-Day on Heaven, because you've got this big open beach area and you're exploring into their sky bunker over here. You've got this really enclosed map for the second one, where you're basically sending out 3 units to take out 5 of theirs, and then you get to the tower on 3. So once you get to the tower, you're basically fighting up staircases to get to the top of a building there. And one lady has just turned several of her undead soldiers into angels. And at that point, they're not even running any angel skills. They're literally just basic soldiers that just transformed. Telling you 2 things. First of all, that this is a thing that can happen. Second of all, that they'll end up keeping the same skills that they had when they transformed. This is why if you'll notice their skill list, they are just running exclusively things like health boosts and some resistances and stuff, and their regular sword skills. But the interesting thing is that, well, this is around the point that if you want to, you can recruit her angels to your side, meaning that you don't have to create your own. Like, if you've got that drop earlier, great, you can create one of your own. But you might notice that if you've, for example, unlocked Lord for Denim or something like that, and you have Recruit Divine, you can just run up and talk to them, and they'll be glad to join you. Turns out being turned into a zombie and then dragged halfway across the world to try to find super weapons for a already dead king isn't exactly, you know, the greatest job description in the world. But either way, it starts off pretty strong here by letting you know that, yeah, these guys are going to be coming in with all kinds of interesting tricks. You got this faction trying to carve their way through the area. You've got all these random hostile enemies that just are completely otherworldly compared to the stuff that you've run into before. Upgraded versions of your like griffins and stuff like that with magical abilities, stuff like Cyclops that can do summons. You've got versions of cockatrices that are basically going to be running you down before you even have a chance to act. I mean, they really start pulling out all the stops, and you start realizing there's death pits everywhere. So now suddenly your heavies that are able to run steadfast carry all of this extra value to them. This is why you get steadfast far later in the game this time around, because it didn't really have much of a value up to that point. It was mostly just an annoyance. This time around, you basically unlock steadfast at the same time that you start unlocking all of these side areas. Anyway, so not only does this place have awesome music, but there's just this buildup of harder and harder units. This is one of the few places that is legitimately just a buildup of a harder and harder gauntlet as you go through. All kinds of new challenges on these different maps, all of these situations where you can expect to essentially see entire halves of your team just carved off like they're nothing. Just giving you the sense that you don't belong here. And like everything in here could easily take any of your units on a 1v1, no problem. And yet you're still here, and every step of the way, they're like the angels from the place are basically showing up here like, well, Actually, I love the logic specifically on this on this map over here on the Tower of Law 12, because you show up there and you see this lady that you've been chasing through this place get frickin' fed to a dragon, and they're like, okay, look, you saw what happens here. You saw we're not messing around. Leave. Like, this is your one and only chance. Leave. And Denham's whole take on that thing is just, well, that sounds like a good reason to attack you, actually. I think his exact words were, those are fighting words. So you're literally just invading heaven because he got insulted by by divine beings. And I love the stupid justification for that so much. Anyway, so this is around the point when you start seeing, you know, how dangerous they can be coming in larger groups, and then you start seeing more and more of these angels showing up more and more as you go through all these different areas. And what's especially interesting is if you've been through Palace of the Dead before, there's a chance that you've picked up some heaven forks. Now, the way that stuff was paced back in the PSP version, there was a chance that you could have a heaven fork at this point, but not only was it incredibly unlikely, most folks didn't really start off with Palace of the Dead because it absolutely sucked, but additionally, well, crafting them was extremely unlikely back then because you had to get some very, very particular drops. Again, you got lucky if you got maybe one or two of those particular drops in order to make a single fork, let alone all of them. This time around, it's far more likely that you will have gotten the components to make those forks going through this location. Every time that you complete a map with no chariot or no incapacitations, you get the two halves that you need to make a heaven fork. But anyway, so there's a pretty decent chance that you've gone and out of curiosity or by accident wound up with one of those forks, meaning that now you're introduced to the Heaven Generals. So the Heaven Generals are basically super bosses that can show up at particular locations. There are 12 of them. There's a lot of mini-bosses that were added in Reborn. These guys were back in PSP, technically, but almost nobody encountered them back in PSP, because you realistically, like, unless you had the guide, why would you even go looking for something like this? But if you have a Heaven Fork in your inventory, it gets consumed upon entering the map, and then you will encounter that boss. And this gives you a chance to pick up one of their unique weapons. Well, semi-unique. You can get multiples of them this time around, and usually they'll drop the unique weapon and/or parts of either parts of a fork or a whole fork by itself, as well as advanced draconics. So the interesting thing is that, yeah, there's multiple maps going through here. Like this is one of them, I recall. I believe this is the one with the archer lady. One of these was. There's also one with the katana lady. I want to say it was one that I remember having kind of a big middle island of sorts. I don't think it was this one. I'm trying to remember. Just trying to remember. I think it was this one that had the katana there. And then I think I think one-hander is on a guy in Farampa. But basically, once you encounter one of them and you get an achievement, you get a unique weapon, you get all of this other stuff, and then you start realizing, like, oh crap, these guys are potentially everywhere, and they're scattered all throughout these different side areas in some of the maps that you maybe didn't want to visit before. So like the very end of there's two big maps at the end of Farampa Wildwood that have a couple of them. There's the shop map in Palace of the Dead. There's parts in the Pirate's Graveyard that have them. But either way, there's so much higher of a chance that you'll actually encounter one of these this time. Like, my first time through, I ran into that fight on accident, and it blew my freaking mind. I was like, I can't believe this actually happened for once. Like, over a decade of running the PSP version, and not once did I run into one of them on accident. And even then, when I did it intentionally, it just felt like too much of a pain in the ass to do a second time. But then when running into them here, finally on accident, it's brilliant. Anyway, so you go more and more and more, like fighting harder and harder stuff, getting a hold of all kinds of stuff that you wouldn't have ever expected to even see in the game anymore. Things like the ability for your warlocks to go and nullify attacks or teleport people. Things like new songs for your fancy songstress over here, getting things like the tambour here for giving everyone a regeneration effect. Man, you keep running into all these new things. Especially there's one here. I didn't end up picking it up yet on this one, but like, for example, stuff like renewal or your divine knights can use sacrifice, which allows them to self-destruct for a 25% chance to revive every member of your party, which is quite the thing as far as being able to give you a renewable source of recovery. And actually, somebody brought up a point a little while ago that I haven't tested yet, which is, technically speaking, I wonder if so they were mentioning technically can't you zombify a witch and have them use something like the sacrifice ability to more or less self-destruct and then revive, and then self-destruct and revive, basically creating the heal nuke from Felseal. Technically, probably, maybe. I have yet to test that, but that certainly sounds like a thing you could probably do. Anyway, so that's a whole story all on its own. But let's just say that this area is paced so much nicer this time around. It's great to see stuff that honestly never got to see much love last time around. Like stuff like the long gun. Unless I missed something, I don't think you actually could get this in like a lot of your fancy endgame guns and things were pretty much relegated to like 2 or 3 maps in Palace of the Dead, meaning that in many cases you never saw a Petronel or a Snub Fusel or a long gun or a Bandashimaki or any of those, or a Cursed Fusel. Like, again, I've gotten multiple cursed weapons on accident. I didn't even know they existed for the first few years of owning the original PSP version. Like, the Snapdragons are a token of the Tactics Ogre side of the series, and in many cases, many just never even knew they existed, they were so rare. Whereas, you know, this time around, you can not only create multiple versions of them, you can get multiple dropped at the same time, and these are just fun kind of custom weapons that you can go and, you know, make your own stuff out of. Granted, this one is still in Palace of the Dead, all of the cursed weapons are in Palace of the Dead, but, you know, seeing stuff like long guns showing up around this point just feels good. Again, I could be wrong, this might have been in this area before, but realistically, I've never gotten many of these particular weapon drops back in the PSP version, despite going through those areas multiple times, doing them a lot in different runs, just due to the utter rarity. Now there's so many redundant areas where you can go and pick up a lot of these pieces of equipment that finally a lot of their cooler stuff gets a chance to shine. Like, one of my favorite memories about going through PSP was going and just creating a save file with all of the stuff unlocked and testing out multiplayer builds, testing out all of the cool builds you could do depending on whether you got certain pieces of equipment. And now this time that they drop often enough that you get multiple copies, and at first they serve a role of just essentially being different versions of the same weapon, but then you can combine them all into a sort of ultimate version that's way stronger than it used to be back in PSP. Like, it just feels good. It not only gives every save file its kind of its own flavor going through it, but it also creates a situation where you can have multiple uniques on, you know, going through the entire party. You can essentially piecemeal out certain pieces of equipment, or, you know, just min-max particular stuff just kind of because you got extras. It just feels good, you know. I love to do that kind of stuff. It just feels good to have access to all these things after it was missing for so long, at least in my head there. Anyway, so San Bronza, to let you know, is extremely difficult. This is going to be an area that really expects you to know some game mechanics. So if you've seen those videos where I was talking about, you know, like, well, if you're going through endgame, you know, you want to pay attention to things like poison, and I've seen those comments of folks saying, like, well, poison's only doing like 100 damage, I can do that with anyone. Cool. How much do you think it's going to do to this guy? How much do you think it's going to do to this guy? You know, how much do you think it's going to do to this bird over here? Like, the tricky strategies, the crazy stuff you run into, the post-game is where you're going to really see a lot of that stuff shine. So, for example, like this bird over here, if you were to go up to him and, let's say, you know, back in dealing with a griffin earlier on, you know, you might go ahead and just throw in a Dragoon, you go ahead and put on their Beast Layer, their Beast Bane, and they're going to one-shot the thing. Then you go on around the mid-game, and suddenly, you know, maybe they're going to take 2 hits to do it. Running around Chapter 4 for the end-game portion there, maybe it'll take, you know, still a couple of hits, maybe 3, you know, on the higher end there. But then around this point, if you try that combination on this bird, you'd maybe do 700 or 800. It would take like 6 or 7 attacks to go and kill this thing, using just Slayer and Bane alone. But then you start getting into those actual interesting strategic combinations, like you send your Terranite in to go stand next to it, you send your Ninja in to go like blow dart it with some poison, and then use concentration to lay a stop on it. Then you bring in your Archer that's coming in with the anti-beast crossbow, and maybe, you know, a Beast Bane on there or something like that. Like, for example, if you wanted to use that crossbow on a Dragoon or something. And then that fear, and then you, for example, take your ranger over here, and you've got his Dynasty King's Meat over here, and you go ahead and chuck that on there for good measure. Now suddenly you're using all of these units as a team, rather than just one guy countering one unit. Now it's like he's hit by fear, he's hit by breach, he's stopped, he's poisoned, he's taken away. You take one shot with that unit, suddenly hits him away for like 3,000 of his health. Poison ticks away for the last 800 or so while he's sitting there and waiting to get back in the fight. And like, it just feels so good to just have this gigantic teamwork emphasis around this point. Because if your whole team isn't working as one cohesive unit, if they're just trying to 1v1 things, they are going to get steamrolled. And that's usually why post-game has a tendency to frustrate many players that didn't realize that. Like, yeah, these guys are coming in with a dozen level advantage because they want you to work as a team. Like, honestly, if you're breaking defenses, if you're attacking on elemental advantages, if you're using debuffs to kind of redirect units and slow them down and stuff like that, like right over here, we have those units dedicated to taking out this guy right from the get-go. We go ahead and we have something like the Lich start focusing down on this one. Combine that with the other Archer focusing down on this one. We have the Pumpkinhead over here. They're going to go ahead and buff the entire party for regen. We're going to attempt to use, essentially we're going to use this Archer over here with a Mind Control Bow to take this guy, redirect him over in this direction. So we've still got Chicken coming in, we've got this guy coming in. Second Charm Shot goes to that Chicken. Chicken gets its Petrification, goes around, hits all of the squishies from the backfield. Golem is hopefully way out of the fight at this point for another couple rounds. This guy's getting singled down by any of the heavy damage dealers. Meanwhile, those guys hopefully within a couple of rounds have dealt with this bird. So now we have their front line being this whole wide team effort, attempting to drop everything at the right time in the right place to counter all of these things that would otherwise be an utterly impossible scenario. And just resulting in this just great feeling teamwork type of situation there. Like, you just love to see it. Like I mentioned that Terror Knight earlier, realistically they probably would be able to hit Terror on both these units at the same time. But you'll notice so many of these maps are timed out in such a way that you're never going to be given too much to deal with at one time if you're paying attention to what's on hand. Like realistically speaking, we can time it out that we know that we're going to have about 3-4 rounds to go deal with these 4 right here before the next waves can properly engage. But then those ones engage, and then they've got other things in there as well. They're coming in with orbs, so they're going to come in with some pretty high alpha strike potential. So we want to deal with these guys. Hopefully these are on our side at that point. Maybe we can keep that consistent. But we break through here, and we know that we're going to want to send somebody up here. Probably going to be our Terror Knight, because he's going to be more tempting due to his dark element here. But we go ahead and we send him forward in order to bait out those attacks, or if we have a Hoplite, we send them over to use Evade to tank those 2 orbs instead. Because they're not only bringing one, they've got multiple units that are going to bombard with orbs at the same time. Like we have 1 dark, 1 light over here, right? And whatever they can hit first, they'll hit first. And many of the Heaven General fights work the same way, where they're going to come in with like 3 or 4 orbs and going to alpha strike the crap out of your team before you have a chance to do anything. And it's like, how are you going to recover from that level of ambush? So there's like everyone's hit by like poison, slow, stop, whatever at the same time. It's like, what is your backup plan? How do you get out of this? And it just feels nice. It is not fair at any point by this point. Anything past Coda, you don't expect fairness. You expect to have a good strategic experience, and it feels great. Anyway, so at this point, we've now gone ahead and cleared Coda 2 and all of that kind of thing. Or rather, we've cleared Coda 1. So we're going to assume that you went through San Bronza. And we're going to go ahead and assume that, you've gone through this map. There's nothing really particularly fancy that happens on floor 15. You just clear the map, and then you go to Palace of the Dead the second time. Another 15 floors open up on the bottom, and you find essentially a screwed-up version of the original end boss of the game, with only a Phase 1. And basically, you just kind of fight through the guy, do all that kind of thing. If you happened to get a Zephyros, though, going through San Bronza, which you've got a solid 5 or 6 opportunities to do so, this will mean that there's a pretty good chance that you've got the Notos, the Boreas, the Euros, and the Zephyros at the same time. And like I said, due to them dropping way more commonly this time, you will likely have all of them. But if you go in here after you've killed Nebith on your first playthrough, you then go through Palace of the Dead, and the second time that you go through floor 100, they'll come in and they'll tell you, like, okay, now you're fighting Blackmoor. So Blackmoor is basically a D&D reference. Hang on, a quick little coffee sip break. And so he's a D&D reference, basically back in the day, one of the first rule sets. I believe it was still called Chainmail at that point, but one of the first rule sets that were a variation of that was called Blackmoor. Anyway, dude's basically a super lich on the bottom. You get the entire ogre set there. You get the ogre blade. All of it just comes from that one fight. And then you also, upon beating him, you get the Ring of the Dead. Or not the Ring of the Dead. Ring of the Dead is something that you will get to... Well, you could have gotten up to this point, but you can also get for free later. You get the Fire Crest. And the Fire Crest is basically just the most broken accessory in the game, giving you pretty much perfect immunities to elemental weaknesses and stuff like that. Just a gigantic stat boost, a speed boost, everything. It's intended to be broken. Like, it's basically intended to be the most broken item in the game. But with all of that stuff acquired, like if you got the Ogre Blade there, you can transfer the consciousness of one of your units into a different unit, meaning you can go back in time, take your over-leveled caster or something like that, go and convert all of their ridiculously high stats or something like that into a way lower level unit to go and give them like double intelligence and mind and what have you. Like you take your lich, you transfer them into a like friggin' like Hawkman or whatever else, or a ninja or what have you, and then suddenly you have ninjas that are doing heavier damage with their weird ninja magics than with summons and what have you, while having steel stance, while having a huge amount of movement. It just allows you to create really broken units, and also you can convert the abilities that they had. So if you want a ninja with reflection or something, there you go. Anyway, so you go through Palace of the Dead that second time. You just use your shortcuts. It's a quick little visit, done deal. You get out of there, you go to Coda 3. Coda 3 allows you to go back in time to Rhyme, basically redo all of the events of Rhyme, including a quick little post-game of just like, oh yeah, it's crazy how he got kicked off a ledge in Hanging Gardens, but he survived anyway. But you save Lancelot there. You basically go through the events of that fight. You couldn't do anything about it the first time around. This time you can, and it's just a gigantic victory lap after everything that you've been to up to this point. Everything that you've been through, rather. Like, you get to see this gigantic army that you couldn't do a single thing to before, and now you just wipe them like they're just crap on the bottom of your shoe. It's a very, very, you gotta experience it kind of moment. It even has its own custom music and everything. And then you get into Coda 4, which allows you to go back to the very beginning, to fight your way through the intro of the game and undo the events of that situation, and that is the final gauntlet, the final challenge. You fight all of the Knight Commander bosses in their prime as duos at first, like as fairly difficult fights in their own right, and then you fight every single one of them, including Tardy, at the same time in the intro. And then, if you decide to do this with only the people that were in the intro in the very beginning, namely that you come in with Denim, Cashua, and Vice, they're the only ones there. However you set them up, they're the only ones you deploy. Then you can actually kill off what's known as, what I typically call Final Tardy there. Basically, his hardest version, like they're all coming in with relics, they're coming in with a 21 level advantage on you, they're coming in with a terrain advantage, they're coming in with extras on top of already having all the Knight Commanders on there, and it's just this wonderful test over like how much have you mastered the mechanics of this thing. Like, you can grind as much as you want and then still get completely destroyed by petrification. But it's this just wonderful final test of just like how much you've learned. Because unless you break the mechanics in half, it is very literally impossible with that setup. But if you have figured out how to break everything, then you'll be able to get through it just fine. And the very final comment that Tardy ever makes in that particular thing is always just kind of funny. Because all he has to say for himself is, yeah, you're not from this timeline, are you? He knows. He's apparently been through this too. Anyway, so there's a lot to the post-game. There's a lot to experience back there. So that's about that. Kind of all I wanted to say on that whole thing. Like, there is so much more to experience. If you're in that boat that you're wondering why it seemed like stuff was easy, go explore the post-game. It's not a quick romp. Easily, the post-game is a solid 10 times longer than the main story ever was. Like, in terms of the mechanical challenges, in terms of the strategic challenges and whatever else, all these areas get new stuff. Like, the post-game areas of all the fortresses have new bosses at the end with Tier 2 Draconics and stuff like that. Like, there's new... You still have all the Heaven General fights, which are, again, scattered all around the world map. I mean, it's one of those games that's just really darn fun to just explore around and accidentally work towards 100%ing, you know? Like this particular case, this save file is quite a decently long ways here, and even still, you know, it's only 50% of events. There's quite a lot of those. Still missing hundreds of items, still missing, or I think hundreds of items. How the hell many am I missing at this point? So you got all the charms, got all the, well, most of the items, got most of the arcanas, got most of the armors, missing a solid chunk of the bows at this point, though. Still missing a couple hundred weapons for melee. Like, there's just tons and tons and tons of stuff out there. And even then, as you can see, like, just look at the comparisons between these different chapters in terms of how wide they can go. It's like, you only have a maximum of 19 or 20 fights in Chapter 2, and then suddenly you get into Chapter 4, and they're like, yeah, no, it's 252 now. So, there's a lot. Anyway, so if you were looking for more content, you were looking for a harder playthrough or whatever else, while I do always recommend going back and doing challenge runs, honestly, this is one of the few games I would really recommend, like, going into all of those post-game areas, experiencing all of this stuff, because it's paced out as if somebody went and just really nitpicked every detail going through those places. So, anyway, I just thought it was neat. Y'all have yourselves a good one. Take care. Thank you for sticking by on this surprisingly long one. I didn't mean to go ranting along for that long, but, you know, coffee's a hell of a thing. Y'all have yourselves a good one. Take care, and I'll see you next time.